this is actually key for mindfulness in general, is I think of it this way. The feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Koch. We all live inside our own personal, private perception box, built by our genes and the physical, social, and cultural environment in which we were born and raised. In this podcast, we explore how although the walls of this mental box are always present, they can expand in states like awe, wonder, and curiosity, or contract in response to anxiety, fear, and anger. I'd like to introduce our esteemed hosts, two incredible and distinguished minds. Dr. Heather Berlin, professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, and Dr. Christof Koch, chief scientist for the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation and the current meritorious investigator and former president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science. Welcome to the Science of Perception Box.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Science of Perception Box. I'm your co-host, Dr. Heather Berlin.
And I'm Dr. Christof Koch.
Welcome to the show. Every week, we feature an aspect of the Science of Perception Box, highlighting the latest research together with our expert guests. This week on Science of Perception Box, we're going to explore mindfulness, anxiety, and how that works in the brain. But before we bring on our esteemed guest, I wanted to ask you, Christof, how do you manage your anxiety?
I go running, I talk to my dog a lot, I take a hot bath.
What does your dog say to you?
He communicates a lot to me. Whenever, there's something upsetting happening, I can just talk to him and he calms me down. He's a Bernese Mountain Dog.
Is there something about that particular breed that's anxiety reducing?
They're big, they're fuzzy, they're gigantic teddy bears.
So oxytocin is
released, yes.
There's people too. You can also hug people.
You can also hug people.
Right.
Yes, but dogs are different.
Okay.
Heather, so
Yes.
Are you anxiety prone?
I do tend to be higher on the dimension of anxiety than, say, the average person. But although I travel a lot and always have, my first night in a new hotel room, I really have trouble sleeping. And I've read this actually a common phenomenon because your fight or flight response is sort of triggered. It's a new environment. Yeah. You're hypervigilant, anything could happen. And so I always have trouble the first night in a new hotel.
Maybe you should bring a dog along, particularly on the first night.
Can I borrow Felix?
Mr. Felix.
Mr. Felix, sorry. So let's introduce our guest. And I can't think of a more qualified and interesting academic to bring to the show to explore this topic. So today we're thrilled to have Dr. Judson Brewer with us. He studies the neural mechanisms of mindfulness, and he's the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also is an associate professor at Brown School of Medicine. He's a leading expert in the science of self-mastery. He's the guy you basically want to talk to if you want to kick a bad habit like smoking or a toxic whatever. He's authored Unwinding Anxiety, The Craving Mind, and The Hunger Habit. So welcome to the podcast, Judd.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great for you to be here. So you're basically the guy to talk to about anxiety. So why don't we just start out by explaining a little bit about how anxiety works in the brain?
Well, I wish we knew more about it, but what we do know is that anxiety tends to be this ramping up of kind of fear of the future. And how that works is we have these two very helpful survival mechanisms. One is fear, in the present moment, like if you're in a hotel room and you don't know if it's safe or not, you hear some unusual noise, your brain's going to say, hey, what is that? Let's go figure that out. Let's reduce that uncertainty. So fear, a very helpful survival mechanism. And it also helps us learn, so if we step out in the middle of a busy street or something, we almost get hit by a car because we're looking at our phone or something like that. Then we learn, hey, put your phone away, look both ways before crossing. So fear, very helpful learning survival mechanism in the present moment, helps us learn to change behaviors like looking at our phones when we shouldn't be. And then also another helpful survival mechanism that probably came along later in evolution is planning, right? Planning for the future, always very helpful. Don't need to explain that. But the interesting, probably evolutionary bottleneck is when you bring fear and planning together. So think of it as fear of present moment, but fear of the future is actually where anxiety comes from. So this anticipatory, oh no, where we start to worry is not actually planning. It's just getting stuck in a talk track of, oh no. And that stuckness actually makes it harder for us to be present and react to what's happening in the present moment. Because when we're anxious, it makes our prefrontal cortex go offline. So it's ironically, it's harder to think and plan for the future when we're anxious right now. But that's where anxiety seems to come from. And from a brain perspective, people have actually looked to see what gets activated. People who are anxious, they feel pretty activated. Well, their brain is pretty activated as well. Mm-hmm. There's a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is ironically what we default to when we're not doing anything in particular. And people with, say, generalized anxiety disorder, they default to worrying a whole lot. So it's been shown that the more people worry, the more they activate core hubs of this default mode network, like the posterior cingulate cortex.
Mm.
So is that because they think about themselves and think about what might happen here and what might happen there, and they have this, I think you call them loop, right? This sort of habit loop.
Yeah, so people can get stuck in these habit loops. And as you're pointing out, Christof, this network, this default mode network, has been now shown to be this self-referential network. So when we're thinking about ourselves in the past, when we're thinking about ourselves in the future, even when we're caught up in cravings for substances or even social media, that network gets activated. And this loop can form. It's ironic. I never learned this in medical school, but as I was struggling to help my own patients with anxiety, I started to see, going back in the literature, somebody had suggested, this guy, Thomas Borkovic, had suggested back in the 1980s that these habit loops form through negative reinforcement, through this learning process. And the way that it works is that anxiety triggers the mental behavior of worrying, which I often think of behaviors like, I stress eat, I smoke a cigarette, I this or that. Worrying actually counts, and it counts a lot because it can actually drive results and drive other types of behavior.
So you're thinking of it as a type of behavior?
Yes.
Although it's not an explicit behavior, it's an implicit behavior of my brain.
Yeah, so it's not something that somebody else can see, like, you look a little anxious, are you worrying? And then we can ask, but we can't just peer into somebody's eye and say, you're worrying, right? So that worrying tends to be this internal thing. And that worrying, interestingly, it's been shown in the literature that it can lead to a distraction from the unpleasant feeling of anxiety. And also, and perhaps more importantly, it can make us feel like we're in control. Now, I want to highlight something really important. Worrying doesn't actually give us control. It just makes us feel like we're in control because we're doing something as compared to doing nothing.
Well, what's reinforcing about that, right? So is it, because the idea here is that somehow the worrying itself will reduce the anxiety, and then then it's reinforced. How? Does it actually reduce the anxiety at all? Or
yeah, so that's an interesting question. It doesn't actually reduce the anxiety. Paradoxically, it increases the anxiety because it feeds back and says, hey, next time you're anxious, you should worry. So the only way that reinforcement works is that there's got to be something rewarding for our brain. So that feeling of control may be rewarding enough as compared to just sitting and wallowing in our anxiety.
So it is a bit of a distraction, or it gives you a bit of a feeling of control. So then how do you break out of that cycle? How do you get because you're imagining, anxiety is just fear of a potential future threat that might never happen, right? And then you're ruining this present moment by imagining something that's terrible that might never happen. So how do you break that cycle?
Let's start with how people have tried to break the cycle and how they all show up in my office, because they've struggled with that. So there's this real emphasis in modern age around, willpower and individual, like, I'm going to do this. And so there's all, whether it's our parents saying, hey, stop worrying, or us telling ourselves and internalizing that and say, hey, you're anxious, stop worrying. Well, we can't just flip the switch and like, there's the worry switch, flip right
or like
down.
Depression, like just stop, just don't be depressed. Like, it just doesn't work like that.
And then we hear that, what's wrong with you? Right. And so that's what's wrong with us. And then we internalize that as well. And then it feeds more anxiety. So the idea here is that we think that we have a lot of control over our thoughts, over our minds, over our worrying. We don't. And the more we try to push against that worrying, the more it pushes back. I love this term where it's like, what we resist persists, right? And so as we resist our thoughts, as we resist that worrying, the more it persists, the more it pushes back. And the more it also just gets fed into this anxiety loop.
So is the idea to accept it? Let it wash over you and not try to fight it?
Yeah. So what we found is, and it's interestingly, I had been doing a lot of research on habit change, helping people quit smoking, helping people quit overeating, stuff like that. And somebody in one of our eating programs said, hey, can you actually develop a program for anxiety? Because anxiety is triggering me to eat. And I was thinking, prescribe medications, but it put this bug in my ear to look back. And then that's where I found this literature and was like, wow, I wish I'd learned this in residency. Right. And so I said, well, I know something about habit change, and maybe we can apply what we're doing to help with the habit of anxiety.
So it's almost like anxiety is like an addiction, or in a way.
In a way, yeah. So I think of addiction, the definition that I learned in residency was like continued use despite adverse consequences. So if we're continuing to use our worrying and it's causing adverse consequences, it could probably fall into that realm. So absolutely, it's
people know that it's bad, but they still can't stop themselves from worrying.
Exactly. And in that sense, it's very similar to other addictions, right? So they know that it's bad, they know that they can't stop, and then they start internalizing there's something wrong with me.
And willing just isn't going to do it.
I would say willpower is more myth than muscle. If you look from a neuroscience standpoint, behavior change doesn't rely on willpower. Otherwise, my clinical practice would look very different. I just tell all my patients to stop smoking, stop.
Well, but on the other hand, there are people like my ex-wife. The day she learned she was pregnant with our now 40-year-old son, she stopped smoking. Mm-hmm. She was a big smoker before. So some people seem to have what conventionally is called willpower. Is it just something that some people have, traits of genetics or their upbringing? But most, or at least people who are highly anxious, don't, and they have to go to other tools?
Well, I would say that, and I can't speak for your ex-wife, but in situations like that, if you look at the neuroscience, the way we form habits is if something's rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. And if it's not rewarding, we're going to stop doing it. So let's bookmark that for a second, because what you're talking about is in that same paradigm, if something is more rewarding, that's going to supersede the old habit. And so if it's more rewarding, if the motivation for a healthy child is stronger than an urge to smoke a cigarette, that she can overcome, people can overcome these urges. It's like, this is more important. I think of this as the BBO, the bigger, better offer. And so they've got that bigger, better offer of, somebody.
And it's very immediate, right? Like, whereas a smoker who you think, oh, well, you might die of lung cancer, maybe that's so far off that it doesn't have that impact. Whereas this is like in the moment, a greater good that supersedes it.
Well, you're a super achiever. You have 2 professional graduate degrees, right? So for
and
those
3 books.
And 3 books, right? So for that, you have to say, okay, I'm now going to work towards these degrees. I'm going to not do the things that my friends do and have fun because I'm going to study for all these degrees, right? So what is that? Is that willpower? Is that just the right habit forming?
For me, it was just, I loved learning. I was a chemistry major in college. I loved these molecules that made up life. Yeah,
Gosh, you're a nerd.
Yeah.
A real nerd.
So I was like, oh, I can, and I can apply some of this research into helping people. And, so it turned out that this MD PhD program was better than just going straight into a PhD for me. And so it was really the joy of learning. I was like, oh, I can do this, and I can get a stipend to study. Game on.
So that was a bigger offer.
It was definitely a bigger.
So, or you can look at it like it's the alternative source of dopamine, right? Of pleasure in a way, because if curiosity is giving you that pleasure and the dopamine, you don't need to get it from, say, the drugs or the partying. It's just an alternative form of pleasure.
The one thing I would say here is we need to carefully differentiate dopamine with pleasure, because I think in the common parlance is that dopamine is a pleasure molecule. Right. It's a motivation molecule. Yeah. And so in my clinic and also in our research, like, the idea is that dopamine gets us to do something, right? If we're hungry, it gets us off the couch to get some food, if we're, whatever. So it's not supposed to be pleasant. It's actually supposed to be unpleasant, to light that fire under our butt to get going. Mm-hmm. So I just want to be clear about that, because often people think, oh, dopamine, pleasure. As you're saying, it's motivating, right? Yeah. And so there can be a joy that comes with learning that can certainly activate some dopamine pathways as we learn. But that motivation feels very different than that itchy, urgy, driven, I have to do this. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that's important to highlight here that also relates back to anxiety is those types of dopamine-driven habit loops, they become habituated. So we always have to get more and more and more and more.
Okay, so let's leave the brain behind and let's go back to the mind. And let's put ourselves in the mind of somebody who has this habit.
Yeah, I want to know how to break it. I want to know how to break
and
the
so what
cycle.
happens in the mind now of this person who's worrying because, there's something might happen or may not happen?
So let's use a real example. So I can think of a number of different patients that I have that actually have used this. So one example, a guy comes in, 40 years of age. He's meets all the criteria for panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So the first thing we did as I was taking his history was I was listening for these elements of this habit loop, right? 3 key elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. For him,
Trigger, behavior,
and result, or from a brain perspective, a reward, right? So for him, he would get these thoughts like, oh no, I'm going to get in a car accident. And those thoughts would trigger him to avoid driving on the highway. That would help. The reward of that was that he wouldn't get a panic attack on the highway because he'd gotten several and they really freaked him out. And he really thought, if I panic while I'm driving on the highway, I could actually hurt somebody. So the first thing we did in that first session was I literally pulled out a sticky note and wrote trigger, behavior, result on it. And I said, okay, is your trigger these thoughts, your behavior is this avoidance, and then the result is that you don't get a panic attack. And he said, yeah. So then I drew arrows between the 3 and his eyes went. I said, well, what did you just realize? And he said, I didn't realize that my brain is doing this. Right. So we mapped out, that's the first step in changing this and stepping out of these loops, is being able to see what they are, mapping them out.
Your trigger, the behavior that it triggers, and then the reward that you get.
Yes.
But how does that relate to me not wanting to be in the hotel room the first night, right? So let's say that brings uncomfortableness and then I anticipate that. So I'm like,
so what's the trigger there? The trigger is, it's a new environment.
New environment.
Fear that I won't sleep.
Right.
And then I'll be tired the next day for whatever it is I'm there to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then the behavior is worrying.
So your behavior might be hypervigilance, might be worrying, those types of things that keep you from sleeping. And then the result is that you don't sleep well.
Mm-hmm.
But where's the reward there? Why would the brain do that?
So here it was probably rewarded in the past by being hypervigilant in, like, oh no, is this a dangerous situation or not?
But still, I want to understand how you then break it. So you identify it as one thing,
Mm-hmm.
then what?
So let's go through. So the second step here is really leveraging some of the strengths of our brain. So if we know that willpower is more myth than muscle, we don't go there, but we go to the kind of the older, the stronger parts of the brain, which is where we can actually leverage this reinforcement learning process. And the key there is knowing the cause and effect relationship. If a behavior is rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. If it's not rewarding, we're going to stop. Let me use a simple eating example. My lab's been studying these, overeating habit loops. And the idea with overeating is not just telling ourselves to stop. Anybody that's struggled with overeating knows that that's a failed, that's dead on arrival. So instead, what we have people do is we have them pay very careful attention as they're overeating. And as they notice what it feels like to overeat, nobody has come back and said, boy, it feels great to overeat. They're like, oh, this is pretty terrible. And what that does is it triggers this learning mechanism in our brain, this reward-based learning. When we pay attention, 2 things can happen. One is we get a positive prediction error if it's more rewarding than expected. And the other is we get a negative prediction error if it's less rewarding than expected. So when we overeat and we pay attention and it's less rewarding than expected, negative prediction error, dopamine fires, we learn, oh, this isn't so good. In pragmatic terms, I think of it as we become disenchanted with the behavior. We're less excited to do it in the future.
How often does this happen, and how powerful does this have to get before it actively curtails my overeating? Is this like year-long, many years practice?
It's a great question. So in a study that we published relatively recently, ready for this? It took 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overate. 10 to 15. That reward value.
You're telling me in a week I can reduce my overeating?
It could happen in a week. It could happen faster than a week. If somebody's really paying attention every time they overeat, it depends on how often they do that. So the key here is the reward value has to drop below 0 to shift that behavior, right? Below it being rewarding anymore. And the second piece with that is that they really have to be able to link that up. Like, oh, this does not feel good, right? So as they do that, they start to become disenchanted, and then it becomes much easier for them. We've got to notice what it feels like in our body. So here, a key element, and this is actually key for mindfulness in general, is, I think of it this way: the feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain. We can't just say I shouldn't overeat, right? The shoulds is a whole habit loop unto itself, but it's really feeling like, what does this feel like? And that's what shifts reward value, right? So 10 to 15 times seems crazy for changing a habit.
Well, but if you have it for many years.
Yeah. But if you look at it from a survival standpoint, we don't have 20 times to determine whether that's a mountain dog or a mountain lion, right? We've got to run when there's danger. You don't get 20 chances to survive.
So what you're saying is basically our body knows, is adapted, and we need to be paying attention to the signals that our body is giving us. So I think about this, like you're in a movie theater eating popcorn and you're mindlessly eating it and you're watching the movie, and then all of a sudden the whole thing is gone. You're like, what did I just do? I just ate. But if you are focusing your attention on either each piece of popcorn, is it crunchy? How does it taste? What does it feel like? Be mindful while you're eating it and attend to your body signals, because your body has this whole, normally unconscious processes that are keeping this equilibrium. But I think sometimes we override that, right? So
Absolutely.
The idea is to attend to what our body is telling us, listen to your body. It's like people who overexercise, If you're feeling sore the next day, don't go push yourself to do it again. Listen to your body.
No pain, no gain.
And then you get injuries.
Yes.
No pain, no gain. So tell me, if we now return to the hotel room, where Heather is lying and she can't sleep. So where would be the negative predictive value there?
So the first step is to map out these habit loops. The habit loop of the hotel, for example, could be thoughts of, is this dangerous place?
There's also existential angst, like I'm alone in the world. You're dislocated from your home. There's all those thoughts. But yes, just
a few things that can trigger this existential. So let's call it the angsting.
Yes.
Where, that actually is activating. It keeps us awake. And then the result of that is don't get good night's sleep. So from a survival standpoint, our brain is asking, is this dangerous or is this different? Right. And so to step out of that, we could be asking questions like, grounding ourselves in our body, like noticing it, noticing the thoughts, like, here are these thoughts that are happening. And then we can ask, what am I getting from this? Right? As I angst away all night and then, check my phone to see how little sleep I'm getting and angst even more, is this actually helping me? Right? What am I getting from this? So we can feel into it directly, like, this is actually making me more activated, more anxious, and we can become disenchanted with that. And then we can also see, this probably isn't going to solve all my life's problems now. And so then we can shift to the third step.
But before we come to that, so you really have to experience this closed state, talking about perception box, this closed state that I'm very anxious, the world, I'm concerned, I'm afraid, I'm lonely. But then how do I open the walls of this box?
Yeah, just to be clear about that, Christof. So we can all do this together. It's like, how does it feel when we're anxious? How does it feel when there's existential angst? Does it feel contracted or does it feel expanded? You're nodding. What would you say?
Closed.
Yeah, closed down, contracted, right? So we can actually even take that and start to ask, how does this contracted experience feel? How does getting stuck in this mindset feel? Doesn't feel very good, not very rewarding. So we can actually leverage that so that we become disenchanted with that as well. And this is where we can then start to step out of it. And actually, just to bring it back with my patient that I talked about with panic. So he had generalized anxiety, probably had it for about 30 years. And what I sent him home to do in that first visit was just to start mapping out his habit loops for anxiety. I should also mention, he was 400 pounds. He was at a very unhealthy weight. So he had some health anxiety because he had obstructive sleep apnea, he had high blood pressure. His liver was very fatty because of the food he was eating. So he comes back, and the first thing he says to me is, "Hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I'm looking at him because we hadn't even talked about weight loss yet. I was going to save that. I said, well, tell me what happened. He said, mapping out my habit loops. And I realized my habit is feel anxious, eat fast food, and then numb myself, right? So trigger behavior result. And he said, you know what? Eating fast food was actually, the other result was it was making me more anxious. It was contributing to my health anxiety. So I got totally disenchanted with that. I don't know if he used that term, but he said, so I stopped eating fast food. He went on to lose over 100 pounds because he was just it was more rewarding to be healthy than to have this temporary relief of eating fast food. And he said it was the easiest weight loss he'd ever had. And he's actually maintained it for years, which a lot of people, when they try to force themselves to diet, they'll yo-yo diet, they'll regain that weight.
So it's in shifting his perspective and maybe, opening up this perception box and not being so closed that helped him change his behavior in a way that shifted the whole habit. It wasn't just a temporary, like, I'm going to go on a diet, right? And then he found that became more rewarding. And it can be painful for people to change a habit. And there does need to be a kind of shift and a reward for something else. Like that shift alone is very difficult for some people.
Yeah. So I think of this as the third step. And I think of that as
It's like a meta step. You have to be willing to change your habits.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because often the willingness comes from the pain that the habit causes. So for my patient, the pain was all this anxiety, and that's actually what he was focusing on first. But then he started to notice the pain of his fast food eating habits. And so there, it was actually, just helping him start to see that and become disenchanted with the overeating, and the eating of the fast food was very helpful for him. He knew that he needed to lose weight. He didn't know how to do it. And so it was really just seeing that it was more painful to eat fast food than to not eat it. That was the reward that helped him step out of the loop. So I think of that as like this third step is these bigger, better offers. And for some people, it can be simply stepping out of an old habit loop that is more rewarding. For others, and I think more generally, we can start to see what are intrinsic behaviors that we can tap into that are probably not dopamine driven so that they aren't habituating, but are intrinsically rewarding. And I think of two flavors here, and this is also what our research has shown and others has shown as well, is around mindfulness training, right? It's curiosity and it's also kindness.
Compassion.
Yes.
Curiosity and compassion.
So if you're stuck in a habit loop that's not necessarily externally behavioral, but it's just in the anxiety and the overthinking, and you realize, okay, this isn't doing anything for me, then the switch would be into mindfulness, into, where is that? How do you stop that mental loop of the overthinking?
Yeah. So the key elements, and we can talk about mindfulness, or let's talk about the elements of it in case mindfulness is a confusing concept for some people. So it's really about being aware of what's happening and also bringing this curious, this non-judgmental, this compassionate attitude to that. So not saying, oh, this is what's happening, it sucks, right? Now we're keeping ourselves closed in our own perception box of what's happening. Mm-hmm. But we're really stepping back and going, oh, this is what's happening. And we're even bowing to it as a teacher. Like, what can I learn from this, right? So really seeing what's happening.
So I can learn that those thoughts, I don't have to identify myself with. That's not me. I can sort of observe me.
And that's a key aspect to it. So noticing, so for example, if we're worrying, so if you're worrying, if you're in a hotel room, or if somebody's worrying that, oh, am I going to be anxious all day? We can first, help our brain see what's more rewarding, worrying or being curious about those sensations and those thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. So to our brains, it's a no-brainer. Being curious feels better. My lab's done research on this. It's just more rewarding.
So you shift your perception from just being in the feelings to, oh, that's an interesting feeling. Let me explore that or get curious about that. But also I like this compassion piece is about opening yourself up and maybe incorporating other people too, right? So I find that if I'm worrying about something, but then I have to go, that I'm helping a patient or I'm doing therapy with someone, I forget about my own problems.
Yes. So as you're highlighting, connection feels good. Connection literally is expanding beyond our own little, like, this is me and I'm stuck in this little thing, to, oh, this is we, we're working together. And so it can actually be very energizing to bring compassion into our days as compared to be completely focused on ourselves. Like, oh no, am I going to get through today? Oh no, look at my patient list. Oh no, I'm, an hour behind in seeing my patients and all of that stuff. All of that keeps us locked, contracted in our worry boxes.
Well, safe. Potentially.
No, that's why it's great to have a dog with you in your bed. You can just hug him.
This is Christof's solution to anxiety.
Yes.
All the world's problems, it's just everyone get a dog.
So tell me, so you're really putting the finger on, people have to be incredibly attentive to their own state of mind, right? Yes. That's really critical.
It is critical. And we found that, in one randomized controlled trial of our Unwinding Anxiety app, we actually got a 67% reduction in these clinically validated anxiety measures. So by training people to be curious and pay attention, it actually can lead to really significant clinically relevant results.
Does acceptance fall into this as well? So let's say you're feeling anxious. You say, okay, this is me feeling anxiety. Like, this is okay. I'm just going to have this feeling and let it
like
sit.
a distancing.
So what about just saying, okay, I'm feeling anxious now. I'm just going to accept this.
I think that's key. And that's actually one of the key elements that some people describe as being core to mindfulness training. It's like bringing that acceptance in. And you can think of it this way. There's this great quote attributed to Marcus Aurelius where he says, what stands in the way becomes the way. Or another quote related to that is like, the only way out is through. So we can't avoid things. But if we accept, oh, here's anxiety, then we can learn to be with it. And the paradox here is that we don't have to do anything about these thoughts, about these sensations. The less we do, the more we are learn to be with them, the more they'll come and go on their own. And so pragmatically, one way that I work with my patients to kind of put this into action is to, think of what anxiety feels like, what worrying feels like. It's like this, oh no. So we're kind of closed down, we're contracted, we're kind of stuck in our box. So if we inject some curiosity, we can flip that, oh no, to, oh, here's a thought. Oh, what does this feel like in my body? And that helps us expand and not be stuck in that box, but really be with our experience. And the other part of that, is we can watch a thought come up. We can watch it go away. We can watch another thought come up instead of like, oh no, there's that anxious thought. Oh no, there I'm worrying again.
So it's like incorporating it it's expanding this box in a way that it incorporates it and allows for it all. And we're not stuck in that.
Well, it's also the realization that we live in this perception box, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to accept that and to try to explore the boundaries of that and maybe expand them, right? You keep on talking about expanding, these expanding states versus these contracting states. Tell me, in your book, Unwinding Anxiety, you make this statement, it's less important to worry about the why, because people worry a lot. I know somebody very close, she keeps on wondering why she's so anxious and trying to go back into early childhood. But you're saying that's not really so relevant.
So if you look at it, the short answer is yes, it's not. And it is often where people get stuck because they think if I can just find that trigger, I can fix it or avoid it. Well, if it's life, hard to avoid life. And if it's something that we don't have control over, which is most of life, neither of those is going to work. So people get stuck in these rabbit holes of why, thinking if I can figure out why, I can fix it. The other problem there is if it's something from the past, it's in the past. And I love this saying, forgiveness is giving up hope of a better past. You heard that, right? Giving up hope of a better past. We've got to let go of the past instead of drag it into the present moment.
But how do you let go of your past?
So herein comes this second step is what am I getting from being stuck in this? So it's like, it's heavy. It's not helping me move forward. All of these things are, it's not rewarding to hold on often to hold on to the past. So instead of saying, I need to let go of this, we can say, how is this serving me? What am I getting from this? Nothing. And we bring in that bigger, better offer. So it's both seeing how painful it is, whatever the old habit is, but also finding that bigger, better offer.
And wanting to make the change. I think there has to be that motivation to do that.
Absolutely. So as an example, somebody, an early pilot test of our Unwinding Anxiety app, wrote me an email and she said, I feel like anxiety is deeply etched in my bones. Mm-hmm. That's how identified she was with her anxiety. That's how much she had created this very strong box where she's like, I am anxious. Mm-hmm. And so the idea there is to, like you're pointing out, recognize, this is actually a box that I've put myself in. There's this Rumi poem, like Community of Spirit, where he talks about, we're stuck we put ourselves in jail, basically, where it's like, why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Right. So he even talks about this closeness of putting ourselves in jail, step outside that tangle of worry thinking, I think is the quote.
But she'd learned to identify herself with anxiety.
Actually, that's where we start, is to see, this is jail that we've put ourselves in, and the door is open.
There's a way out.
And that way out is through awareness, being curious. Look, this is a box.
Right.
This is a box that I've created. And if I've created it, I can uncreate it. And this box could even be a habit. Some of us win the genetic lottery. Some of us get big dogs and hug them a lot. And then for the rest of us, there's this feeling like, there's something wrong with me. if I have anxiety. Me, boy, I was pretty anxious in college. I still get anxiety. I, used to get panic attacks during residency. I created a freaking program. I wrote a book about anxiety. I still get anxious, right? But it's okay. It's like, okay, here are these feelings of anxiety. And the more I can learn to accept them and be with them and open to them, the more they're going to come and go on their own and not create a problem.
No, wait. So you're saying you still get anxious, but haven't you mapped out your habit loop and
but the feeling can still arise.
It open?
Yeah. So this is really critical, because often people think that anxiety is something they need to do something about. For a habit loop, it's a behavior. And what we tend to fall into the habit of doing is worrying. So that's something they can work with and unwind as a habit loop, is the worrying piece. With the anxiety, it's learning to be with it, allow it, open to it, even embrace it. Like, oh, here it is, as compared to, oh no, I don't want this.
Mm-hmm. So bring it back to your patient. Whatever happened with his anxiety?
So as I mentioned, my patient at that second visit was starting to map out these habit loops. He was becoming disenchanted with eating fast food. And at the same time, he was starting to learn to work with his anxiety. I was walking out of our School of Public Health one day at Brown University, so it's a pretty busy street. I walk out onto the sidewalk. This guy pulls up, rolls down his window. It's my patient. I'm thinking, great, he's driving. Gives me this huge grin. And he goes, "Hey, doc, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm headed to the airport to pick someone up."
Wow.
So that what that highlights is, the idea here was that he was learning how to see what his mind was doing, how he was boxing himself in, right? Oh, I'm an anxious person. He was learning to map out that as a habit loop and see already expanding that box. Like, oh, it's not me, it's a habit. And then taking that one step farther and saying, oh, by being curious about those sensations, he could not feed the habit, step out of it, and actually lean into it so that he could go along and, move forward in his life.
That's a really wonderful story. I mean, just to show how you can really turn things around by changing your perspective and being aware and noticing these habits and learning how to step away from them and break them and become curious.
Absolutely. And one thing I just want to highlight here as related to the perception box is that we create these. One, we make them habits. Two, we blame ourselves. Three, which gets in the way of us being able to see them as boxes. And then open those doors so that, as Rumi put it, we can, move into ever widening rings of being.
I like that a lot.
Well, I thought we would do something that would be kind of fun, is just to ask each other maybe some perception box questions to probe a little bit deeper.
Funny that you asked that.
I mean, we have some questions here. I don't know what you're going to ask. I have questions I'm going to ask. But I think it would be a fun little exercise for us to, as individuals, probe a little bit deeper and see how closed in our boxes are and if we can expand them out. Let me ask a question. If you were able to drop all your identities, what would you be? Who would you be?
Nobody. And it would be amazing.
So you're comfortable with the infinite nothingness of not having an ego and just being?
Well, I'd like to say I'm completely comfortable with it, and that would probably be a big lie. I would say just seeing how painful it is and how much energy it takes to hold up some ego identity. The more I can look into those, and boy, I had plenty over the years. It's like, wow, that's painful. That's painful. That's painful. It makes it easier to let go of them, and also to see to be inspired by people who are truly humble, and seeing how, and then in a moment of humility, how much better that feels than trying to put myself out there in the world.
There's something very restful about those people. They sort of spread this atmosphere of just equanimity. And you know very quickly when you interact with them. They're just calm and cool. And
yeah, there's like a presence of that. Christof, for you, have you ever gone through something that was very upsetting or painful that you later viewed as a blessing?
My complete loss of self. It was absolutely terrifying. What happened there, but I ended up in this state of what Buddhists call non-dual self, where there was no more Christof, no more memory, no more body, no more world, no more dreams, desire, memory, no time, no space. But there I was, And it has completely removed most of my anxiety. It removed completely all my anxiety around death. I used to sort of lie in bed when you can't sleep and you worry about what happens after you die and you're dead for a long time or for a really long time or for a really, really long time.
Yeah, I don't like this idea at all.
Yeah. And
it's just making me anxious.
No, it's like looking, I'm a climber. So it's like, looking down at an abyss, but it's bottomless abyss, right? And you freak out. You get this existential vertigo. But I not had, since that episode, hasn't happened a single night. And because I've experienced egoic death. My ego died and it was okay. So what is the biggest lie you've ever told about yourself? Funny enough.
About myself or
about yourself, to yourself, not to others, to yourself.
God.
The biggest story you've told that turned out not
to be true?
To be true.
I think early on, I told myself when I was a child, I had a traumatic upbringing. Very traumatic at an early age. And one of the things I told myself to protect myself was, I don't need anybody. I can do this all on my own. I don't need these people. I'm just going to be really independent. And it served me well. It was a driver and I was going to be independent and I work really hard and get all these degrees and will never have to need anybody. But then I realized that no, you actually do need people. It was a lie I told myself in order to survive being around people who were not serving me well. And in those circumstances, it was better to be, independent. But as I got older, I realized that is not, that's not true. I do need people.
And cats.
And cats.
And dogs.
Maybe. I'm not going to go as far as dogs. I'll stick with cats. This has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Judson Brewer. And if you'd like to learn more about your own perception box, spend time this week answering the same perception box questions that we asked Dr. Brewer, and check out our other questions on the website unlikelycollaborators.com. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the show or listen wherever you get your podcast. So I'm Dr. Heather Berlin.
And I'm Dr. Christof Koch. Thank you very much.